The first thing I remember is the sound the metal made when it finally gave way. Not the harsh roar you'd expect, but a thin, tired shriek like an old gate dragged open in cold air. Fog was hanging low among the trees that morning, and the light under the pines was the color of wet concrete. When the lid lifted, a breath of stale, trapped air slipped out and wrapped around us heavy with rust and something dry and ancient like cardboard left too long in a damp basement. For a moment, nobody spoke. Even the birds seemed to hold still in the gray branches overhead. My eyes went to the inside walls, to the dull sheen of scraped metal, where fingers had once torn at the surface, leaving pale crescents in the darkness. I remember the way the clay clung to the sides of the box, dense and cold-looking, as if the earth itself had been holding its secret in a tight fist. Someone's radio crackled behind me, low and fuzzy, but I barely heard it over the pounding in my ears. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Back then, before any of that, my world was much smaller and much quieter. Seattle in August has a particular kind of light, the kind that falls soft and even over the streets, as if the sky is holding a thin sheet of cloud between the sun and the city. Most mornings I'd walk from my apartment to the bus stop with a travel mug warm in my hands, the air cool enough to pinch my cheeks, the smell of damp concrete and roasted coffee drifting out of the corner cafe. At the library where I worked, the air conditioning hummed and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and my days were measured out in the soft thud of books on the check-in counter and the whisper of pages being turned at the tables. I remember the feel of that circulation desk under my fingers, smooth from years of elbows and hands, and the way the big glass windows turned gray when the marine layer rolled in off the sound. Caleb would call me on his lunch break more often than not, his voice coming through my phone like a familiar song over a tinny speaker. He'd be walking along some busy downtown sidewalk. I could hear the hiss of bus brakes and the murmur of strangers as he talked, telling me about some nightmare line of code or a server that wouldn't behave. He was one of those people who could stare at a screen for 10 hours and then still want to hike 10 miles on the weekend, chasing whatever light the sky had left. In the evenings, if I stopped by his apartment, there was always that same combination of smells, brewed coffee that had gone a little bitter on the warmer printer ink, and that faint metallic tang from his camera gear. His desk was a tangle of cables and memory cards, but his prints laid out carefully on the dining table were crisp and deliberate fog lifting off rivers, alder branches beaded with rain, the pale bark of birches against dark soil. Our parents lived down in Vancouver, Washington, in a small house that always smelled like furniture polish and whatever my mother had simmering on the stove. They were the kind of people who left the TV on low in the background, the glow flickering across family photos along the hallway. Dad had traded chalk dust for garden soil, spending his days in the backyard with dirt under his nails and a ball cap pulled low against the watery sun, while Mom made lists at the kitchen table, the soft scratch of her pen as steady as a metronome. When we'd visit on Sundays, the drive down I-5 always felt the same. The low gray sky, the wet shine on the asphalt, the clusters of fir trees blurring past the windows. Inside, the warmth from the oven and the clink of plates made their house feel like it was sealed off from whatever weather was pressing against the glass. Caleb and I had our rituals. Friday nights were usually mine. I'd stop by his place after work with a bag of takeout, the paper warm and slightly greasy in my hands, and we'd sit cross-legged on his living room floor with a movie half-watched on the TV. His apartment was small, but it had a big north-facing window that looked out over the city, the kind of view where the lights come on in layers as the evening deepens. He liked to leave that window cracked, even when the air was cool, letting in the distant hiss of tires on wet pavement, and the occasional wail of a siren echoing between buildings. Sometimes he'd set his camera on the sill and shoot long exposures, the shutter clicking softly while we talked about nothing more important than what book I was reading or which trail he wanted to go back to once the fall fog rolled in. He had been talking about that forest for months before he ever went back there. Not the forest in general, the Gifford Pinchot is a big breathing thing, but a particular stretch near the foot of Mount St. Helens. He'd been there once in early spring when the air still had a bite to it, and the snowpack was retreating in streaky patches along the ditches, and he couldn't stop talking about the way the morning mist clung to the tree trunks. In his voice I could always hear when he'd found a place that felt different, like a song caught in his head. It would get a little softer, more focused, the way it did when he talked about light shifting through branches or fog settling into a valley. He kept saying the same thing, that the air down there felt thick, like it had weight, like you could almost hear it move through the branches if you held your breath long enough. On my end, life was steady in a way that felt almost comforting. At the library, the days blurred together, the patterned carpet under my shoes, the faintly dusty smell of older paperbacks when I shelved them, the cool slide of plastic covers under my fingertips. My coworkers knew me as reliable, the one who came in 5 minutes early with damp hair from the drizzle and a cardigan that smelled faintly of fabric softener. Regular patrons had their own rhythms. Mr. Peterson at 9 sharp to read the paper in the corner by the window, the young mom with the stroller at 10:30, her baby's little socks always slightly mismatched. When the air outside turned warm and a little heavier, the hum of the HVAC and the distant rush of traffic through the cracked door became the summer soundtrack inside that building. Caleb was deep into planning a photography show that year, something he'd finally gotten a small gallery in Capitol Hill to agree to. He kept a notebook in his camera bag, a cheap spiral-bound thing with a cover that had already started to curl at the corners. When he flipped it open on my kitchen table, I could see lists written in his quick, narrow handwriting, river shots, low fog, old-growth vanishing places. He talked about ecosystems the way other people talk about old friends, his fingers tracing lines on the map spread out between our coffee mugs. The map itself smelled faintly of ink and graphite soft from being folded and refolded, and his fingertips always seemed to pick up a faint dust of gray from its creases. We'd grown into that easy, middle-aged sibling rhythm, separate lives that still looped back toward each other. Sometimes late at night he'd send me a grainy photo from his phone clouds stretched thin over the sound, or headlights smearing the wet black of I-90. My own evenings were quieter. I'd sit on my sofa with a blanket over my knees, the lamplight warm and yellow against the beige walls, the murmur of the upstairs neighbor's TV seeping through the ceiling. I liked the smallness of it, the predictability, the kettle whistling, the feel of a paperback's spine cracking just enough as I lost myself in a story. If there were cracks forming in that routine, they were hairline too fine for me to see at the time. Looking back, there were small moments that snag in my memory now, things I walked right past then. There was the afternoon he came by the library to pick me up for lunch, bringing with him the smell of rain and cold air, his jacket shoulders sprinkled with droplets. He stood by the front windows, staring out at the gray street a little too long, the reflection of fluorescent lights cutting across his face in the glass. When I asked what he was thinking about, he only shrugged and said, "It's getting harder to find places that feel untouched," his voice softer than usual under the low hum of the computers. I remember brushing it off, pointing him toward a new trail guide we'd just gotten in the thick, glossy pages cool under my hand as I set it in front of him. He smiled, but his eyes drifted back to the rain streaking down the window pane like it was trying to wash something away. Another night he called me later than usual. I was already in bed, the sheets cool against my skin and the room lit only by the faint blue glow from the alarm clock. His voice in my ear sounded closer than it should have, even with the faint hiss of his apartment heater running in the background. He asked if I ever felt like the city was too loud, like you couldn't hear yourself think over the buses and the traffic and the neighbors' music bleeding through the walls. I joked that was why I lived with a stack of books instead of a roommate, and he laughed, the sound small and a little tired. He said he was looking forward to some real quiet, the kind where all you hear is your own breathing and the wind in the branches. By the second week of August, the air had that particular weight it gets before the fall rains settle in for good. The mornings were cool enough that you could see your breath for a second if you stepped outside with a hot mug in your hand, steam curling around your fingers. I remember standing on my balcony one of those mornings listening to the faint rush of the freeway and the distant call of a seagull while the city slowly brightened from blue-gray to silver. Caleb had emailed me his rough itinerary the night before a short trip a few days down to that same stretch of forest he'd been talking about for months. His subject line was simple: chasing the mist. I opened the message on my phone in the half-dark, the cold metal of the railing under my palm as familiar as the rhythm of his plans. We talked once more before he left, just a quick call squeezed between my shift and his last grocery run. I was in the kitchen, the faint smell of dish soap and coffee grounds hanging in the air, wiping down the counter with a damp towel while the phone rested between my shoulder and ear. He rattled off the usual: he'd top off the gas, grab a paper map just in case, check in from the road if he had service. I could hear the rustle of plastic bags and the squeak of his fridge door as he packed the ordinary sounds of someone getting ready for a long weekend. He sounded steady calm in that easy, focused mood he always had before a hike, like a runner tying his shoes at the starting line. When we hung up, the kitchen felt a little too quiet, the faint buzz of the refrigerator suddenly very loud in the small room. That night I left my phone on the coffee table instead of plugging it in across the room like I usually did. Outside, the streetlights cast their soft orange pools on the wet pavement reflections, shimmering whenever a car rolled past with a low, steady hiss. I sat by the window longer than I meant to, fingertips resting against the cool glass, watching the occasional pair of headlights sweep across the building across the street. Somewhere out there he was packing memory cards and checking batteries, zippers rasping shut boots set neatly by the door. I remember telling myself it was just another trip, just another stretch of forest and fog, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I turned off the living room lamp, the darkness in the apartment felt thicker than usual, and the quiet that settled in around me had an edge to it I couldn't quite name, like the pause before a breath you're not sure is going to come. The weekend he left started like any other, with the kind of steady gray sky that makes the whole city feel slowed down a notch. I remember waking up that Saturday to the faint rattle of rain against the kitchen window and the low hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. I made coffee, stood there in my slippers, listening to the drip and hiss of the machine, and told myself I'd hear from Caleb sometime that afternoon, just a quick text about the trailhead or the weather. He always checked in, even if it was only a few words and a blurry photo of the woods he loved so much. By noon, my phone was still dark, the screen reflecting the soft light from the kitchen lamp, like a blank eye staring back at me. I didn't think anything of it, not yet. Sometimes the forest swallowed a cell signal whole, and he had warned me it might happen. Still, I glanced at my phone twice more before leaving for work, feeling a small tug of unease settle low in my chest like a stone in water. At the library, the shift had the usual quiet rhythm, pages turning chairs, scraping softly across carpet, the faint scent of old bindings and fresh ink drifting from the returns bin. But I kept my phone on the counter instead of tucked in my bag. Every time I straightened a shelf or helped a patron, I'd glance down at it, expecting the small pulse of light. Nothing. When my break came, I stepped outside and stood under the awning, the drizzle misting against my sleeves and cooling the back of my neck. I called him, listened to his voicemail message spill out in that warm voice of his, and hung up before the beep. It didn't worry me, not really. He was probably miles up some old logging road by then, taking his time setting up a shot or waiting for the fog to clear. But the absence of his reply stayed with me like a faint chill that wouldn't shake loose. By the time I clocked out, dusk had wrapped itself around the city. Streetlights glowed in long orange streaks on the wet pavement, and the scent of rain was sharp enough to taste. I drove home through a blur of wipers and headlights, the radio turned low so I could hear my phone if it buzzed. It never did. At home, I microwaved leftovers, set the plate on my lap, and kept glancing at the phone on the coffee table as the evening deepened around me. His silence felt unusual, like a missed step on a staircase. I called again before bed, sitting on the edge of the mattress with the cool air brushing my ankles. Straight to voicemail. I told myself he was fine, that he was probably asleep in his tent, the night air thick with pine and the distant rush of water. But when I turned off the lamp, the dark felt heavier than it had the night before. Sunday morning arrived with a washed-out sky and that soft, muted quiet that hangs over the city after rain. I woke early, my hand reaching instinctively for the phone. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages. The apartment seemed colder, as if the air had thinned during the night. I poured cereal into a bowl, listening to the crackle of it echo in my kitchen, and tried not to stare at the silent phone on the counter. I called him again. Voicemail. Halfway through the morning, I called my parents. I tried to keep my voice steady, but my mother heard the strain before I finished my first sentence. She asked if I thought something was wrong. I told her no, just that I couldn't reach him and didn't want to worry alone. Dad said the forest out there was known for patchy reception, that Caleb would roll back into service sooner or later. I agreed, but the unease had grown larger by then, moving from my chest to my throat. When afternoon came and still nothing, I drove to his apartment. The hallway outside his door smelled faintly of someone's cooking garlic, maybe onions, and the carpet was damp from the morning rain tracked in by neighbors. I knocked, waited, knocked again. No answer. He'd told me he'd be gone a couple of days, so I knew the empty apartment didn't mean anything by itself. Still standing there with my hand on the cool metal of the doorknob, I felt a tightness in my stomach I couldn't explain. I walked back to my car slowly, the stairwell echoing with each step. That evening, when the sky turned the color of pewter and the streetlights flicked on one by one, my phone finally rang. But it wasn't Caleb. It was the gallery owner he'd been working with. She said he'd missed their scheduled check-in about the prints he planned to bring after his trip. Her voice was polite but uneasy, like she wasn't sure she wanted to say what she was thinking. I told her I hadn't heard from him either. When I hung up, the apartment felt too quiet. I walked from window to window, listening to the rain tick against the glass, listening to the distant hum of traffic, listening for something that might break the silence. I tried calling again. Nothing. I texted him twice. "Call me when you get this." And then shorter. "You okay?" Both messages sat there unanswered, glowing quietly on my screen. As the hours passed, fear crept in slow and steady like rising water. It wasn't a single jolt, but a collection of small signs. The check-in he missed, the unfinished message thread, the quiet. By 9 that night, I could feel it, something wasn't right. I opened my laptop and looked up the weather near Mount St. Helens, hoping a storm might explain everything. But the report showed only light overnight showers. I checked for road closures, trail conditions, anything that could justify the silence. Nothing. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept turning the light on, lying there with the dim glow settling over the room while my mind paced in circles. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined him somewhere under that dark forest canopy, mist hanging low, the cold gnawing at his fingers. I told myself he was fine, that he was just out of range. But I'd been out there enough to know how quickly those woods swallowed sound, how easily they could make a person feel small and forgotten. When dawn came pale and colorless, I made the decision. I'd been resisting. I called the sheriff's office in Skamania County. The woman who answered had a calm, even voice, and she took down the details: his age, his vehicle, where he said he'd be headed when he was supposed to return. She asked if he ever left without telling anyone. I said no. She paused a moment, the phone line carrying a faint rustle of papers. She said they'd check if any deputies had logged sightings of his vehicle along the forest roads. I thanked her. When I hung up, I realized my hands were trembling just a little, the phone slick in my palms. It wasn't long after that call that my parents phoned me back. Mom's voice sounded thin, like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Dad said they were getting in the car and driving up. Hearing the fear in their voices made everything feel sharper, realer. The day stretched on painfully slow, the air in my apartment turning stale as I paced from room to room listening for the phone. Every small sound outside the slam of a car door, the rumble of a garbage truck sent a jolt of hope through me, but none of it was him. Around midday, the sheriff's office called again. A deputy had located a vehicle matching Caleb's description near a remote part of the forest. They wouldn't tell me more over the phone, only that they would send someone by to talk with me. The words clung to me like a cold draft. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the rain sliding down the outside of my balcony door, each drop carving its own slow path down the glass. When the call ended, I realized I was gripping the railing hard enough for my knuckles to ache. The hours that followed felt suspended. I didn't turn on the TV or the radio. The only sound in the apartment was the faint hum of the heater clicking on and off, the occasional sigh of the building settling, and my own footsteps moving from room to room. I tried calling Caleb again, even though I knew it was useless, the quiet click before his voicemail message looping like a worn-out tape. That silence on the other end felt deeper than it had the day before, as if something had shifted out there in those miles of trees. Late in the afternoon, the sky dimmed into an early dusk, and my living room filled with the cool blue light that comes right before evening fully settles. I stood by the window watching the wet pavement glow beneath the streetlights as cars moved slowly through the neighborhood. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt drifting in through the cracked window. Then I heard it, the low crunch of tires on gravel outside, deliberate and steady. I stepped onto my balcony and looked down. A sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop near the curb, headlights cutting two pale beams through the thinning rain. The engine shut off. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hiss of traffic and the soft patter of water dripping from the eaves. A deputy stepped out, closed his door quietly, and lifted his hat in a slow, respectful gesture before starting toward my building. And in that small, heavy silence, I knew the world I had woken up to that morning was already gone. The morning the search began, the air outside my apartment felt colder than it should have for late August. A thin mist clung to the street, softening the edges of the parked cars and turning the cruiser at the curb into a pale blue silhouette. When I stepped outside, the gravel under my shoes crunched in that slow, deliberate way that makes you aware of every step you take. The deputy waiting for me, an older man with a tired posture, held his hat in one hand and a small notepad in the other. His voice was calm, but the way he cleared his throat before each question told me he already sensed where this was heading. I gave him everything I knew when Caleb left where he planned to go when he should have been back. The quiet between my answers felt too long, like we were both listening for something we knew wouldn't come. By the time I followed him downtown to the sheriff's substation, the morning fog had begun to burn off, revealing a pale stretch of sky that looked almost metallic. Inside the building carried the faint smell of old paperwork and stale coffee. People moved with the steady, purposeful motions of a team that had done this before. Missing hikers, lost campers, wanderers who stepped off a trail and never found their way back. But there was a shift when they took down Caleb's name, his vehicle, his last known location. I saw it in the way the dispatcher's pencil slowed for a moment in the glance two deputies exchanged near the radio desk. The forest out there was big, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Everyone who worked these cases knew that. They asked me to wait in the lobby while they contacted the ranger station. The vinyl seat beneath me was cool, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, as if the whole room was breathing in shallow drafts. When the door finally opened, Detective Mark Delaney motioned for me to come back. He wasn't unkind, but he had that steady look I've seen on doctors before delivering news they wished they didn't have to give. He walked me through the plan in a low voice. Units would head to the area at first light, rangers were on standby, and a dog team had been requested. Each detail made everything feel heavier, more real, as if some invisible line had been crossed, and there was no going back. We reached the trailhead near noon. The forest greeted us with that damp, earthy scent that rises from the ground after days of rain-wet bark moss and the faint sweetness of pine needles breaking underfoot. His car sat there just off the old road, silver paint dull beneath the patchy light that filtered through the canopy. A deputy had already sealed it off with tape. Seeing it made my breath hitch. The windows were fogged slightly from the morning chill, and a scattering of dry pine needles clung to the windshield like a thin veil. I pressed my hand against my mouth and tried to steady myself. Caleb's tripod could be seen through the glass, the metal legs folded neatly the way he always left them. The first search team gathered near the hood of a ranger truck. Maps were spread across the metal surface corners, held down by a flashlight and a dented thermos. A radio crackled with static, followed by a clipped voice that faded out again. Delaney ran his finger along a narrow, faded road on the map, a logging track no longer maintained, then circled an area where the forest thickened into a dark swath of fir and hemlock. That's where they would begin. He spoke quietly, but I could hear the strain behind his calm tone. They expected to find tracks, discarded gear, broken branches, any sign a person had passed through. Early searches usually did. The dogs arrived shortly after their handlers kneeling to adjust harnesses and check radios. The animals moved with quick, eager steps, noses testing the airtails, flicking with expectation. When one of them was led toward Caleb's car, it lowered its head, sniffed the doorframe, then pulled forward sharply, its claws scraping across the gravel. It moved into the brush, following something none of us could see. Hope rose in me like a warm rush. I followed at a distance, watching branches sway as the dog pushed deeper into the forest. But 15 minutes later, the radio carried a note of frustration. The scent had vanished where the trail dipped into a washout. The ground churned mud and loose gravel from the last storm. The dog circled, whined, circled again. Nothing. Teams fanned out in slow, deliberate lines. Their neon vests flashed like small moving lanterns between the trees. I walked with one group along a narrow trail that wound past a moss-covered stump and dropped toward a shallow ravine. The air grew cooler. They're touched with the smell of cold stone and running water. We paused, calling his name, letting our voices linger in the damp air. Only the creek answered its quiet trickle, sounding impossibly small in that wide silence. I kept listening for something else, a branch snapping the shift of weight on wet leaves, but the forest stayed still, almost watchful. Back at the trailhead, the rangers noted every cleared area on the map. They spoke in low voices, pointing to topographic lines and unmarked clearings. Someone mentioned a footprint found near a wooden footbridge several miles north, a print that roughly matched Caleb's size. My chest tightened, but the excitement faded quickly. Another deputy returned from the site an hour later with news it could have belonged to anyone. The trail was used by hunters and hikers. There wasn't enough definition in the print to be sure, and no other impressions were nearby. As the day stretched on, the search grew more methodical. Helicopters swept overhead blades, chopping the air and sending waves of cold wind through the treetops. From below, the shadow of the aircraft slid across the forest like a silent passing cloud. Volunteers moved in pairs, their radios popping with static, their boots sinking into patches of soft ground. Every now and then, someone would stop, kneel, and run a hand through the damp leaves, lifting a small scrap of plastic or cloth. Each time, the same ritual followed: a careful bagging, a quick inspection, and then a slow shake of the head. Nothing belonging to him. I stayed by the command area, watching the lines of orange and yellow jackets disappear and reappear among the trees. Every time a group returned empty-handed, a small knot formed in my stomach. My parents arrived in the late afternoon, their faces, pale eyes wide with that raw fear that makes people speak softly even when they don't need to. My mother gripped my arm, her fingers cold despite the warm air. Dad stood a little apart, scanning the tree line as if he might see Caleb step out at any moment. His shoulders were hunched, something I'd never seen before. We didn't say much. Fear had narrowed everything down to breathing and waiting. As evening approached, a ranger suggested checking an old campsite not far from a creek crossing. The place had a reputation among locals, a spot hunters used in late fall, scattered with charred stones and rusted tin cans half buried in dirt. When the searchers got there, they found a fire ring with several blackened branches, the center filled with ash that was cold to the touch. A lid from a tin can lay nearby. For a moment, the radio chatter picked up. I felt a flicker of adrenaline. But within the hour, the lab confirmed what they suspected. It was old, too old, and not connected to anyone who'd been through the forest recently. Another dead end. That night, when they suspended the search until morning, the air turned sharper colder. Mist seeped through the pines, making the beams of flashlights look like thin, ghostly ropes stretching through the dark. The forest around us felt impossibly large, every trunk rising like a pillar into shadow. As we stood in the gravel lot listening to the final briefing, I realized just how small we were out there, how easily a person could vanish into that expanse of green and gray. The realization made my hands tremble, and I tucked them into my jacket pockets to hide it. Rumors began circulating by the next morning, the kind that sprout whenever the woods swallow someone without explanation. A man who lived near the forest stopped by to ask if the missing hiker was the photographer people sometimes saw wandering the trails with a heavy pack. A camping couple claimed they'd heard someone yelling for help days earlier, though they couldn't say exactly where. Others spoke of a lone drifter seen deeper in the woods, a man with a tangled beard and a habit of shouting at passers-by. None of it was verifiable. But the stories drifted through the search area like smoke impossible to ignore. Even among the deputies, there were quiet glances exchanged now and again. After hours of searching, when hope thinned and daylight grew short, their voices dropped as if something unspoken hung between them. The forest had its own history, a long one, and the people who worked these mountains seemed to know that sometimes an explanation didn't come neatly if it came at all. On the second afternoon, clouds thickened overhead, casting everything in a muted gray. The air smelled of rain that hadn't quite arrived yet, cool and metallic. I watched from the tailgate of a ranger truck as a new group of volunteers checked their radios, cinched their packs, and headed into a darker, steeper section of woods. Their boots scraped the gravel as they disappeared beyond the trees. I followed their progress until the forest swallowed the last flash of neon orange. My breath fogged lightly in front of me. Every nerve in my body felt stretched thin. Hours passed with no news. Just the rumble of a distant helicopter and the occasional murmur from the search coordinators studying their maps again and again. I found myself tracing the lines on those maps the same way Caleb once had my fingertip following old roads and narrow ridges, trying to imagine where he might have gone. But the forest felt different now, less like a place he loved, and more like a maze with the walls constantly shifting. Late that afternoon, while the sky dimmed into an early dusk and the radios crackled with teams preparing to return, I saw a deputy walking toward us from the tree line. His steps were slow, measured. The brim of his hat was damp droplets of moisture clinging to the edge. He held something small in his gloved hand, his face unreadable in the fading light. He lifted his eyes toward me as he approached, and in that quiet moment, the low glow of the setting sun caught on the object he carried just enough to show its shape, but not enough to tell me what it meant. And the air around us seemed to still as if the forest itself were waiting for what would come next. The deputy reached us just as the light began to fade, his boots sinking softly into the damp needles scattered across the forest floor. In his gloved hand, he held a scrap of metal small enough to hide in a pocket, but it caught the dim sun in a way that made it look sharper than it was. He didn't speak right away, just lifted it slightly, as if he wasn't sure he wanted us to see it. Then he murmured something into his radio, short and low, and whatever answer came back made the rangers straighten all at once. The change was immediate. Quiet voices shifted into brisk instructions. Someone unrolled a length of bright tape. Another ranger jogged down the trail toward a piece of ground none of us had noticed before. The air around me tightened. I didn't know what they'd found, not yet, but the forest had gone still in a way I'd come to recognize that hush that falls just before something breaks open. I followed as they moved deeper into the trees, each step carrying me further into a patch of woods where the ground felt oddly flat beneath the moss, as if something solid lay under the surface. The air turned cooler and carried the faint metallic tang that lingers after rain hits old iron. A technician knelt down with a ground scanner, sliding the antenna slowly across the soil. The machine let out a sharp, irregular chirp that didn't sound like any root or rock. The technician's face tightened. He adjusted the settings and swept again. The sound came back stronger, almost insistent. By then the rangers had pulled a wider perimeter. Radios buzzed with sudden urgency. One of them spoke into his mic, his voice steady but edged with something I'd never heard in him before. Detective Delaney turned toward me, his features pulled tight as if bracing for a blow he couldn't stop. He said they needed me to step back, that they weren't sure what they were dealing with. I did as he asked, holding on to the rough bark of a cedar trunk to steady myself. The bark was cold, the kind of cold that seeps straight through your palm. I watched as the team brought in shovels and small hand tools, their movements slow and controlled. Nobody wanted to disturb more than necessary. Dirt clumped softly as they scraped away the top layer, revealing darker, heavier soil beneath. Then the sound changed. A dull, hollow thunk. Not rock. Something manufactured. Something buried. A ranger leaned over the edge of the shallow pit and brushed away a final curtain of earth. The shape that emerged made my breath catch. A rectangle. Straight edges. Metal. The surface was the color of old pennies, streaked with clay and faint lines of corrosion. Even with the dirt still clinging to it, it looked wrong there, too. Rigid, too intentional, like a secret someone had tried to press deep into the earth. Delaney whispered a few words I couldn't catch. The technician backed away and radioed for the forensic team and a generator. The air around us shifted from routine search to something heavier, something none of us were ready for. They worked by the glow of portable floodlights as dusk folded into night. The hum of the generator rising and falling in the cool air. Moths circled the beams of light, drifting in lazy spirals. I stood with my parents a short distance away. My mother kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her shoulders trembling no matter how many times Dad rubbed her back. The smell of fresh-turned soil mixed with diesel fumes drifted across the clearing. The metal surface grew clearer as more dirt was removed, thick-walled, reinforced the seams along the sides rough and uneven, like someone had welded them in a hurry or without proper tools. It wasn't a storage box. It wasn't a tank. It was something else entirely. When the excavation team finally freed the container enough to attach cables, I felt my whole body tense. The winch strained, groaning as it lifted the heavy structure from its bed of packed earth. Clay and stones slid off in slow rivulets, thudding softly into the pit. The underside showed no hinges, no handles, nothing that suggested it had ever been meant to open. Still, the forensics crew circled it like surgeons preparing for an operation. One of them ran a gloved hand along the welds, pausing at a seam that looked thicker than the rest. Another checked for ventilation holes and found none. Their silence spoke louder than any explanation. A cutting tool whined to life, sending sparks skittering across the metal. The sound was sharp grating, echoing off the trees in a way that made me feel strangely hollow inside. My mother pressed her face into Dad's shoulder. I stared at the changing line of orange and silver as the blade chewed through the seal. It took nearly an hour before the final piece of the lid gave way. When they pried it open, a rush of stale, heavy air spilled out, carrying the scent of rust-damp fabric and something else dry like old wood left too long in a sealed attic. The investigators stepped back, and for a moment everything felt suspended. Then the lead examiner leaned in with a flashlight. His voice, when it finally rose, was quiet and grim. Inside, slumped slightly forward, wrapped in the remnants of a jacket I'd folded for him years ago, was a human form. Bones visible under scraps of fabric. The curve of a skull catching the beam of light. My heart dropped so suddenly I had to grip the bumper of a Ranger truck to keep myself upright. The cold metal seeped into my palms. My mother let out a sound more breath than voice, and Dad pulled her close, eyes fixed on the ground. Delaney approached me with a careful, deliberate step. He told me gently that they couldn't confirm identity yet, but he didn't have to say it. Every part of me already knew. The world around me dimmed as if the lights had flickered and never fully come back on. I felt numb and strangely lightheaded, like my body had stepped away from itself and left me standing there alone. In the beam of the flashlights, they found more inside the container: a battered metal mug, a cracked flashlight, a notebook so swollen from moisture they had to lift it carefully with gloved hands. Near the far wall lay a camera lens, the kind he used on every trip. The examiner called out that the interior walls were scratched thin, frantic lines etched into the metal. The words settled over us with unbearable weight. When they finished their initial assessment, the forensic team moved with solemn efficiency. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded. The container was sealed for transport. Deputies pulled a wide cordon around the clearing. The generator's hum continued to fill the silence, steady and unfeeling. Later at the command vehicle, they told me what they were beginning to suspect, not officially, not in so many words, but carefully, like each syllable might crack something open inside me. Someone had put the container there years before. Someone with the skills to weld thick steel by hand. Someone strong enough, equipped enough to lower a structure that heavy into the ground without leaving obvious signs. And someone who had watched the forest long enough to choose a spot no one would stumble across. A name surfaced almost immediately among the investigators. Leonard Len Pike, a recluse who'd been living near the Lewis River, known to a handful of locals as a man with a bad temper and a talent for metalwork. He'd once worked in logging. He knew the forest roads that no longer appeared on maps. And he had a scattered history of run-ins with hikers he believed were trespassing on his land. The pieces weren't official yet, but you could see them aligning on the investigators' faces. Back at the pit, the team lowered a tarp over the open cavity. Flashlights moved like dim lanterns through the trees as they began packing up equipment. The night had grown colder, and you could see faint clouds of breath forming in the beams of light. Someone handed me a blanket. I didn't remember asking for one. My parents stood close, but everything around me felt distant, like I was looking through a window at a scene still trying to make sense of itself. When they drove the container out under escort, the headlights washed over the clearing, turning the wet leaves white for a moment before swallowing them into darkness again. The forest seemed to fold in behind the departing trucks, as if reclaiming the space the moment they were gone. A light rain began to fall, soft enough to feel like mist on my cheeks. They asked us to return to the station for statements. Inside the cruiser, the air smelled faintly of wet wool and the lingering scent of the deputy's coffee. None of us spoke on the drive back. The road wound through miles of shadowed trees, the headlights tracing narrow paths through the fog rolling down from the ridge. At the station, the fluorescent lights felt too bright, almost clinical after the dimness of the forest. I gave my statement in a room where a map of the county hung on the wall, colored pins marking places I'd never heard of. Over the next hour, more officials arrived, federal jackets, unfamiliar faces, clipped voices trading quiet instructions. A press briefing was being discussed down the hall. Phones rang, doors opened and closed. But all of it felt muffled around me like I was listening through layers of thick glass. When Delaney finally walked over to tell us the next steps, autopsy lab work. Coordination with federal agents. His voice was gentle, but the words carried the weight of finality. My mother wiped her eyes with a tissue she'd been holding in a tight fist. Dad rested a hand on her shoulder, though his own face looked carved from stone. We left the station long past midnight. Outside the parking lot glistened with a thin sheen of rain reflecting the harsh white lights in trembling shapes. As we walked to the car, the distant sound of a generator from a neighboring building hummed through the cool air, steady and relentless. I paused before getting in and looked back at the station doors, bright, metallic, unyielding. Behind them, people were already preparing reports, notifications, next steps. The discovery was no longer just ours. It belonged to the system now, to the process that follows when the worst truth finally comes to light. And standing there, soaked in the quiet night, I felt the first deep exhale of what would come next. Long hours, hard questions, and a reality I hadn't wanted, but could no longer turn away from. In the hours after they lifted that metal box out of the earth, everything moved with a strange, deliberate quiet, as if the whole forest had agreed to lower its voice. The investigators worked through the night, their flashlights sweeping across damp needles and dark soil, while radios crackled with clipped orders. My parents and I were ushered back to the station once the site was secured. The air inside the building felt overwarmed compared to the cold woods, and the lights were harsher than I remembered, humming faintly overhead. Officers moved around us with a mix of urgency and restraint, their boots tapping softly against the tile, each step sounding like punctuation in a sentence none of us were ready to read. We sat in a small room just off the main hallway. A coffee machine gurgled in the corner, filling the air with a burnt, bitter smell. My mother stared straight ahead, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were colorless. Dad sat close beside her, one hand resting on her knee, his fingers trembling slightly each time a door opened somewhere down the hall. I felt like I was floating above myself, watching a scene that belonged to someone else. The officers spoke gently when they came in, explaining what would happen next: transport examination, identification. Their voices were respectful, but every word seemed to carry a weight that kept pressing down on my chest. News traveled quickly through the community. By morning, local reporters were lined up outside the sheriff's office, their breath visible in the cool air as they tried to catch sight of anyone who might offer a quote. People from town stood in small knots on the sidewalk, murmuring in low tones. Hands slipped deep into jacket pockets. Some recognized me as I walked to the parking lot with my parents. Their eyes softened. A few nodded, subdued and careful. It was a strange thing to be visible and invisible at the same time, wrapped in grief that felt too heavy to put into words. The authorities moved fast once the lab confirmed what we already knew. They focused on the man they believed had welded that container, the one whose name had come up again and again in the reports, Leonard Pike. His cabin sat not far from the old timber roads, a lonely structure surrounded by rusted scrap and half-forgotten machinery. I didn't go with the deputies when they executed the warrant, but I remember the description clearly. Windows covered from the inside, metal tools laid out in rows, and shelves lined with items that had no business being there. Cameras, backpacks, watches, trinkets that had once belonged to people who never came home. What they found in that cabin explained more than I ever wanted to understand. Notes, maps, objects arranged with a kind of rigid, unsettling order, and a journal filled with writing that didn't sound like a man losing his mind. It sounded like a man who believed he'd found some twisted purpose in the silence of the woods. The investigators would later tell us he'd been watching hikers for years, choosing those who walked alone, convincing himself he was protecting something sacred by removing them. They arrested him at dawn. He walked out of his cabin without a fight, hands lifted, clothes coated in dust and wood smoke. When the deputies drove him away, the sun was just beginning to rise, turning the river mist into a pale silver ribbon. I heard he sat quietly in the back seat, staring at the treetops as they passed, as if he were saying goodbye to something only he recognized. The trial came the following spring. The courthouse smelled of old varnish and floor polish, the kind of scent that settles deep into the wood after decades of stories passing through its doors. The gallery was full most days families of other missing hikers, reporters with their notepads open, townspeople who remembered hearing strange stories about a hermit in the hills. My parents and I sat in the first row, the air around us thick and still. I listened as prosecutors laid out the evidence, each piece placed carefully on the record. The metal seams that matched the equipment in his shed, the personal items found in boxes, the trails marked on his maps, the entries in his journal. When they described the container, the walls, the lack of ventilation, the scratches inside, I felt my stomach turn, but I kept my gaze steady. I owed Caleb that much. Pike spoke a few times, his voice low and oddly calm. He said he wasn't killing anyone. He said he was restoring balance. He said the forest needed quiet. The courtroom seemed to shrink around us when those words hung in the air. I saw one of the jurors swallow hard, his jaw tightening as he looked down at the evidence again. When the verdict finally came guilty on every count, it didn't bring the relief I'd expected. The judge read the sentence slowly, the syllables falling like stones into a deep pool. Pike stood motionless. No apology. No explanation. Only that same distant stare, as if he were already somewhere else listening to a world the rest of us couldn't hear. After the trial, life didn't snap back into place the way people imagine. Seattle kept moving around me, buses rumbling down wet streets, diners filling with the smell of bacon and coffee, library patrons returning books with small apologies about due dates. But I felt like I was walking through a version of the city that had shifted an inch to the left. Everything familiar was still there, just different. Certain places became hard to pass by. His apartment building, the trailhead sign by the old parking lot where we used to meet before hikes. Even the aisles where he bought his film and soda felt heavier somehow. My parents sold their house and moved closer to me for a while. They said it was temporary, but we all knew it wasn't. Grief has a way of rearranging the map of your life whether you're ready or not. Eventually, I found myself drawn back to the forest. Not to the clearing where they'd found the container, not at first, but to the overlook where Caleb had taken one of his favorite photographs. The air up there smelled of cold stone and resin. The wind threaded through the branches with a soft, steady hum. I'd stand there for long stretches, feeling the rough grain of the wooden railing beneath my hands, letting the quiet settle into me. With time, that quiet became something else. Not the silence that hid him, not the silence that man tried to claim as his own. A quieter kind, a gentler one, the kind that lets you breathe again. A small memorial stands now near the old road where Caleb parked before his final hike. It's simple, a wooden post, a small plaque, and a place to leave flowers or stones. Hikers stop there sometimes, some leave notes. Others just stand for a moment, letting the forest breeze brush their faces. I go there every year on the day he set out. I light a small lantern at the base of the post, the flame flickering softly in the dusk. And each time as the light settles into the dark around me, I think about the echoes that remain, how grief can hollow you out, but also how memory can fill those empty spaces with a quieter strength. The forest still holds its secrets, but it also holds the last place he stood, the last breath he took in clean air. And that's something I can carry even on the hard days. Sometimes in that stillness, I hear the faint rush of wind moving through the tall pines, steady and unchanged. And for a moment, it feels like he's there too, walking just ahead, leaving a trail, only I know how to follow. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel, so these stories are never forgotten.